Good afternoon and welcome to the I-29 Dairy Webinar Series. Today's program is on milk pricing reform and other federal policy updates. We are delighted to have Managing Director of Edge Dairy Farms, Luca Sjostrom, here with us today to present, and Director of Public Affairs for Edge Dairy Cooperative, Gefvert, who will discuss Cooperative's emphasis on flexibility and fairness and take a deeper dive into these concepts as she reviews the update of the Hill and the Farm Bill. So, as I always say, Karen, the podium is yours.
Thank you, Fred. Thank you very much for having us. We're happy to talk about Edge's milk pricing reform priorities, and Lucas is going to get us started with the first portion of our presentation. Lucas, do we have you with us? He may have just dropped off.
I'm back.
There you are. All right. It's all yours.
Well, hello. Good afternoon. My name is Luca Sjostrom with Edge Dairy Farmer Cooperative. Karen Gefvert will be grabbing the second half of our presentation as we'll talk to you about milk pricing reform priorities. I'm going to go through more of the federal order portion, and Karen will work more on the legislative portion. There are two things simultaneously going on right now. We did not know this when we planned this webinar, but we probably could not have picked a better date to not only be right in the middle of it and not also be able to tell you the full story of what's about to go on, because we are in the middle of a lot of decisions being made by a lot of groups around the country. Edge Dairy Farmer Cooperative operates in 9 states. We work for dairy farmers who ship to proprietary plants. So we are a cooperative for those who ship to proprietary plants to do verification, also work on their behalf, do milk verification, also work on their behalf doing federal policy. I also have a dual role, and Karen does as well, working for the Minnesota Milk Producers Association and in Wisconsin, the Dairy Business Association. And we have a fourth brand called Farmers for Sustainable Food. And so if you see those names or see us, we do work for all of those things, working for the producers that are interested in those specific areas. We will start off with an overview of why this is happening. And so backing up, before the pandemic, actually, I think a lot of people believe that the pandemic caused this. But before the pandemic, we had negative PPDs starting in late 2019 or mid 2019. And so everyone was knowing this is a problem. Negative PPDs, of course, create a situation where people, processors, plants smartly depool, and also create a situation where if they don't depool, farmers get a negative on their milk check, and plants that are in class 1 or fluid, cannot depool. So they are stuck for at least that portion of their milk. And so that really set off a lot of groups looking at how do we go back to bare bones and make sure we're building a better system. What Edge did, and I was part of this in a different role, but what Edge did is we created a multi-state task force. We met monthly at least, but several weeks per month, and then broke off into subcommittees and created some ideas of what reform might look like and how to get back into a system that works better for dairy farmers, ultimately with the best price discovery possible. That is what we want. But at the same time, looking for a system that is fair, flexible for farmers, flexible by region. And I think for the first time, we're coming to a realization. We've kind of gone through this exercise in beef, in the beef industry and that side of cattle. We've seen it in fresh fruits and vegetables, that we may need to set some bounds without being prescriptive, set some bounds around basic contractual expectations. And Karen's going to cover more of that. So when we get into contract expectations, we also need to talk about competition, and we also need to talk about equity between producers and processors. And ultimately, what we're doing all of this for is, yes, we want to do good for our farmers and farmers across the upper Midwest, especially we represent a cheese region, and that's very important to us. But ultimately, we want that producer-processor relationship to be as good as possible, no matter if that's a producer and a private processor or a producer and a co-op. Just more trust throughout the system, so much as possible. So that's kind of the underlying reason that we are working on this and why our board of directors asked us to work on this. And finally, we'll get into next steps. So I'm going to just read this quote. I think this will be the only thing I read. I'm sure everyone on the webinar can read, but I'm going to read this quote from our CEO, Tim Trotter. Dairy farming today looks vastly different than it did at the turn of the century. Farms big and small are more sophisticated in how they conduct business, from implementing more sustainable practices to adopting cutting-edge technologies. The list of ways dairy farmers look toward the future is growing every day. All the exciting modernizations present an interesting duality. The federal system through which these innovative agribusinesses are paid is nearly 100 years old, with little meaningful reform since its inception. All that to say, I am so excited that there are dozens, literally, of participants on this call today, because normally when I start talking about federal milk marketing order reform, that's when you turn off the computer or radio or phone. And so I'm glad you're here today. That's only one part of it. But because we want to strengthen that relationship, we went back to the core of whatever it takes to do that. And that we have found, unfortunately, through our task force and through our work, does require a complicated cut through of some of the current rules, some complicated changes to the current rules. And if we were in charge, and of course there's many voices here, if we were in charge, we would put some things that, which Karen will talk about, into legislation now, so that we set up a better system in the future that also would not drop the milk price at a time where we don't want to drop the milk price. So that's something to be mindful of, because if we fix the system, but in the next 12 months drop the milk price dramatically so that none of our producers can participate in the system, obviously that doesn't meet our goals for our producers' success. And the second side of it is the federal milk marketing order reform. That process is playing out. The secretary has a decision. I'll get more to that at the end of my portion of the presentation. But we want to make sure that we don't do too much too fast, but at the same time move as swiftly as possible. And so I will lay out our cooperative's two principles, flexibility and fairness, in the forthcoming slides. I think I got into why we're proposing, but again, at the bottom, we're looking for better price discovery. We're looking for flexibility by region, and we're looking for a ultimately better producer-processor relationship. And the way we weigh those out is trust and transparency. We think farmers are looking to align with processors they believe in, and this is probably especially important for private processors. You might say historically, because if you belong to a traditional marketing, or not marketing, but processing cooperative, there's some of that involved. But today, we have a situation where you can't move very easily, and we hope that changes. We're going to keep pushing at the state level and at the federal level for ways to increase our ability to increase production capacity in our states. But when you line up with that processor, you want to make sure you have the same values. If that processor is going to look to continually grow, take on more sustainability initiatives, that's one way to look at things. If that processor is more of a status quo, slow and steady, you're going to want to make sure the visions align in that way. Next, long-term viability. I mentioned that just a bit ago. If we get to a better price discovery system, but lower the milk price quickly to do that, we want to make sure we have both short-term and long-term viability. But that's what we started on this task force and the road we marched down. We wanted to make sure long-term we have the best price discovery available, but short-term make sure that we are not disrupting the markets to get there. Next, sustained value. More competition in the marketplace will build and sustain value for all. Maybe you ship to a proprietary processor that you love and could not imagine moving. Maybe you ship to a cooperative that processes your milk and you're in the same boat. However, we believe that no matter which situation you are in, if we have more competition, that's good for farmers. And that's ultimately the sustained value we want to create for you, for our members, for all farmers across the upper Midwest and frankly, the nation. And finally, when we do all those things, so we can do all of those things, we could give a lot of benefits to farmers. But if we leave our processors behind, that's not going to help them out. And that's going to probably erode the three things I just talked about. So we need fairness in business, whether your milk is pooled or not, whether you live in an order area or not. we need some benefits back to the processors to make sure that this system continues to exist. And underlying that, I haven't even said it yet, but the reason for federal orders, the reason they're in place from 100 years ago is because of sustaining the fluid milk market and keeping orderly marketing within that. If we do not have federal orders, farmers lose a lot of protections. Karen will get into some of those that we aim to save. But if we do not have federal orders, which they were originally set up to share the class 1 or the fluid revenue so that we kept orderly marketing. And in our market, Federal Order 30, we have a system where the level and amount of fluid milk has dropped so much that our processors are often depooling more than ever, and therefore are telling us, I'm not seeing value from this anymore because keeping my cheese market is more important than sharing the revenue of class 1. So that's where this all came from. And we'll go into our priorities now. So I got into this a bit, but you can see kind of faded, and I think you've seen the map before. California has been added in the past few years, but we have our 11 federal order markets, and each of them is going to need a little different shape is what this looks like. In the upper Midwest, we have a huge cheese market. In the Pacific Northwest, they have a huge powder market. So one of the things we wanted to do was ensure we are not writing rules for the upper Midwest that hurts any other portion of the country. Next slide. And so as we think about these different mixes and think about the milk sheds across our regions, we have a proposed way to get it done. We want to introduce legislation, which is the only way to do it. We can't do this through the federal order process, but we want to introduce legislation which just allows for more flexibility. We're not going to be able to tell you how to do it. We're not going to dictate that all regions must do it like X, but allowing us all to be more creative. That flexibility in our region may look something like uniformed benefits. In a different region, it may be another way. But the whole point is if we go to a federal hearing today, we can't even talk about these issues. We're not able to operate within the federal order hearing and bring these issues up. They will be ruled out of order, and they will not allow us to speak about them because within the current rules, there's one way to price milk, and that's a uniform milk price. We think we can better incentivize our processors to participate. One way, again, through the uniform benefits model is to line up better our fluid, our yogurt, our cheese from the demand in the market all the way back to our farmers. And so rather than having a blend price, and we're open to ideas, maybe we need to talk more about how do we line up the prices specifically that plant makes. And lots of others have other proposals not related to this, but this is all getting wrapped into the federal order marketing reform scheme that's going on right now. So just to back up a little bit, you may have heard in April, 2 organizations put forth a proposal to change federal orders. In May, another organization came forward, and last Friday, we gave testimony. Edge Dairy Farmer Cooperative gave testimony, as well as many others, on Friday to say, hey, here's the proposals we think should be considered if we went forward. There's a federal milk marketing order hearing website, which I can certainly stick in the chat box after I'm done talking. I'll do that. And you can read all the proposals and all the different opinions on them. We have one, many other organizations have one. And then they asked for kind of the technical readouts of it. So we updated those on Friday and finally sent in our final submissions on Tuesday of this week. And so with that first part done, now there's a decision that looms for the end of July. The secretary has to decide, yes, we will go forward to a hearing, or no, we will not. Like I said earlier, Edge believes that we have a lot of work to do, which Karen will talk a little bit about. We have a lot of work to do ahead of the federal order hearings. One thing that almost every group has brought up is updating make allowances. That is something that most likely would drop the milk price, and therefore, not only do we not think it's time to do that, but we don't even have a good assessment of what should be in a more modernized make allowance system. And so we believe, and some others do believe, that we should look at more parameters, but we believe we should do that through legislation now so we can set up a better system in the future. So all of these things are looming for what the secretary decides should be a federal milk marketing order reform hearing. If it happens, it would begin on August 23rd. It's not a guarantee that it happens. If it happens, it will be in Carmel, Indiana. And again, for one last time, we don't believe it should happen now as Edge. We believe if it does happen, it should be comprehensive in nature and be looking at the whole system. And we believe that the legislation Karen's about to talk about in a second should be going first so that we can set better rules of the road. So that's from our Upper Midwest cheese system, where we've got a lot of competition. We've got fantastic farmers that want to take advantage of what they have in front of them in the future. And all of us looking 10, 20, 30 years out for what should the system look like. So to get to those changes in the federal order system, I will be around if anyone has questions. We need legislation first, like I said, and Karen will talk about that next. Thank you, Karen.
Great, thanks, Lucas. So moving into the second portion of Edge's proposal, which is contracting.
Karen, if I can interrupt, I'd like to remind the listeners, they can put questions into the chat box as we go along. That way they won't forget them, and we'll make sure that they get addressed as we get to the end of the presentations. Apologize for the interruption.
Excellent reminder, Fred. Thank you very much. And we'd be happy to take questions once we wrap up the slideshow on the Edge proposal, and then we will talk a little bit more about the Farm Bill in sort of a second segment. So it's coming. You'll have plenty of opportunity for engagement and questions, and we'd be happy to do that. So as Lucas had mentioned, the second portion of our proposal is about contracting principles. So if we're going to provide flexibility for how milk is priced and make some changes, there also needs to be some security and some surety as to how we move forward with business arrangements between processors and farmers. And so those were vetted out and essentially put into three different categories. One was, what are the basic contractual expectations that we need to have between farmers and processors in potentially a new working business environment? The second part is, how do we continue to maintain competition in the marketplace? And then the third is ensuring that we have equity in that marketplace and that everything is addressed that needs to be addressed for security purposes. So I'll go into the first bucket is that basic contractual expectations. So what does that look like? We think that the first provision should be establishing a written contract between processors and farmers. As Lucas had mentioned before, prior to COVID, we saw some changes with negative PPDs, and that continued to be exacerbated throughout the COVID pandemic. And essentially what we found out was that there aren't any provisions in the federal orders that require specific requirements within that PPD line. So when farmers were receiving their milk checks, they didn't know what was encompassed within that line item. So some didn't even have that line item. So establishing a written contract of what the terms of the business relationship is between the farmer and the processor is a good first step in establishing what the expectations are that farmers need from processors and processors need from farmers. And we think that's just good standard business practices. Farming, agriculture, dairy for many, many years was built on handshakes, and handshakes and deals are great and wonderful, and they make everybody feel warm and fuzzy, but unfortunately they're not enforceable in a court of law. So modernizing the basic way that business practice occurs within the dairy industry. Timely payments. So within the federal order system, and if your milk is pooled, there are established parameters for how often farmers are paid for the milk that they produce. If the federal orders were to be dissolved or go away, those protections are not in place any longer. And so while we haven't seen that issue occur with farmers not being paid in a timely manner, that is a possibility. And so one thing that our working group said was really important was to maintain timely payments for farmers to be paid every 2 weeks as they look at as they create a perishable product and in order to maintain their business. And then any advance checks that are provided to farmers are done in accordance with the current month's prices. The third piece is verification of weights, tests, and samples. So for farmers who send their milk to a proprietary plant, There is the ability to utilize a third party to verify weights, tests, and measures of the components and ensure that those pieces of equipment are operating and calibrated appropriately. And so this is an opportunity for farmers to verify and have security in knowing that they are indeed being paid based on accurate measurements and components of what it is they are sending to a processor. And we think all processors, all farmers should have that ability to have a third party verify their weights, tests, and measures and samples. Contracting termination notice. We know that there are options in the marketplace when it comes to where farmers can ship their milk and where processors can get their milk. And so we have seen some changes and some unfortunate circumstances in this area in recent history. And so establishing contract termination notice is an important thing, as especially we deal with a perishable product and tight markets as far as the amount of milk that's out there. We need to ensure that we have some leeway for farmers to find a new market for their milk should they have the opportunity to do that, and vice versa for processors to look at other locations on sourcing milk. So again, normal contractual provisions that we think should be codified and established in a written contract. So the second bucket is competition. So what does that look like, if we may? Transparent pricing formulas. So a lot of times we have differences in how that is communicated. And so establishing the details of what that looks like, including those line items on checks for farmers or on pricing statements, including provisions such as somatic cell count, protein, volumes, clearly spelling that out in the agreement as to how farmers are going to be paid, what that calculation looks like. And then if there's going to be a change in any of those formulas, allowing sufficient notice from processors to farmers as to what that change is going to be. And again, enhancing communication and transparency between farmers and processors. Competitive risk management. This is the ability for all of our farmers to utilize risk management programs in conjunction with the processor that they're shipping things to, allowing that to take place, to engage in and utilize risk management products that are available, both private as well as government-supported risk management programs. And then the third piece of the competition bucket is exclusivity and volume limits. So if a farmer imposes exclusivity, or if they impose exclusivity and volume limits, then they are able to, a farmer is able to look at an alternative. So if there's a two-tiered pricing provision or that exclusivity limit, they are able to look for alternative options for their supply of milk. So this is allowing farmers to not be beholden to processors when exclusivity limits or two-tiered pricing is established, so they can continue to operate their business and move forward, because that sometimes doesn't always work with a farmer's bottom line and how their 5-year, 10-year business plan and financing works with the provisions that are put in place from processors. So allowing flexibility and options for farmers in the competition region. All right, and then the third bucket is equity. So operating in good faith. We want to enhance that relationship and that trust and that transparency between processors and farmers, and acting in good faith is a great way to do that. Many of our relationships do operate like that, and so we think that's something to build upon. And then any disputes in those contracts that are established, have an already established arbitration process that's very clear and very spelled out as to how that process proceeds. And then creating, if unfortunately we have to get to that situation, establishing meaningful penalties for unfair behavior if there are to be breaches in a contractual agreement. Equity opportunities for all farmers. So if a processor is to provide any kind of incentive to one patron, that incentive should be offered to all patrons that would meet the same criteria that that processor would provide. And that is including farm location, size, milk quality, and anything else that might fall within that. So providing an opportunity for all farmers to have competition in any kind of deals or incentives that are available. And then the last piece is equal treatment of processors. So at this point, our position is that all of our milk buyers, regardless of how they are structured, should be playing in the same field and having the same provisions, so that we equal the playing field. And that is regardless of whether or not they're located or operating within or outside of a federal milk marketing order. So the question is next steps. So where do we go from here? So stakeholder meetings. So Edge has been having conversations with other national dairy groups and regional dairy groups in order to communicate essentially the two-tiered provisions in our proposal, which would be fairness and flexibility, and pursuing those in a legislative format. So it's important for everyone in the upper Midwest to be on the same page as far as what's happening and how we bring industry stakeholders together. So that was really the charge of Secretary Vilsack, USDA Secretary Vilsack, when he put in no uncertain terms that he expects the industry to come together and have consensus. And while that's a tall order, we have been building bridges and having conversations to find out from our farmers and our processors and other dairy groups, organizations, how do we find those areas of consensus? What are they? And how do we move those pieces forward? Lucas talked a little bit about the federal order hearing and the different proposals from many other groups. That is a separate process, but again, there is a desire in that area as well to find areas where different groups can come together and find consensus and make some meaningful change. So when it comes to meaningful change, Edge is asking for comprehensive reform. Any kind of reform really has to be global. It really has to look at how do we address and discuss the issues that are facing dairy, and modernizing the federal orders in order to look at flexibility as well as fairness has a good mix of trade-off, looking at competing in the marketplace as well as having some provisions, some security provisions put in place in those contracting principles. And that all has to be done legislatively. So a lot of questions have come up as we have met with stakeholder groups as well as members of Congress to talk about our proposal. The question is, why aren't these provisions being discussed in a federal order hearing? And really it comes down to these provisions fall outside of the scope of the federal orders. It is language that has to be changed legislatively in order to allow this conversation to occur. At this point in time, if Edge were to have submitted this proposal to the Ag Marketing Service in national meeting that was held last week, it would be considered out of scope. So it is outside of the parameters of what they can address. So there does need to be legislative change in order for any kind of flexibility or contract.
Karen, you appear to have frozen. You may want to try the obvious one, mute and unmute. Otherwise, you may have to log back in and maybe Lucas can kind of continue.
Yeah, I think I can try to pick up where Karen left off. I'm sure she'll log back in soon. But oh, looks like she's back already, potentially. anyway, what's coming up here with our legislative change is we are aiming for the next Farm Bill, which is right around the corner. The Farm Bill. Oh, did I lose screen too, or did you take that down, Fred? Oh, it was Karen's screen. That's why. Welcome back, Karen. I will let you take off. I said nothing of me, so carry on.
My apologies. Apparently the satellite decided to, change over. Rural living. All right, so we've gotten to the point of questions. I am unable to see the chat. So Fred, I'm not,
Karen,
I don't
Karen,
see anything in the chat.
You need to reshare your screen if you have screen items that you want to talk about.
Oh, it was just a question slide. So unless
Okay.
anybody needs to see the word questions with milk
Nope.
behind it, I think we are ready to move on to the next portion of the webinar.
Very good, very good. At this point, I would prefer if folks would type their questions into the chat box, but if we have certain decorum here, go ahead and unmute and we'll take questions directly. Well, let me start the process out. You'd referenced that the information, the proposals for the FMMO hearings. So it appears like there were 38 different proposals from 12 different organizations on that last day. Help us understand, that all has to come together as a single reference, if I understand it correctly. Lucas, you want to tackle that?
Yeah, so USDA has the obligation to decide what proposals should move forward. So, and you can read this, there's a good pamphlet on the USDA AMS website. We're in existence, not we as Edge, but we as the federal orders are in existence across the country in the areas where they are to have orderly marketing of fluid milk. That's what they're trying to do, and with that, keep the shelves full. It doesn't say those words, but keep a stable supply of fluid milk on the shelves. And so, as you think about that, USDA has to look at them from kind of an economic and administrative point of view and look at which proposals will help us do those two sorts of things. And as Karen mentioned, some of the reasons we are looking at legislative changes is because we are thinking maybe we should be thinking about some of the other benefits federal orders give us and add those to the list of things that we should keep together. So whatever legislation, or excuse me, whatever proposals come to USDA right now, those are the things they need to weigh out, is how do we keep the best orderly marketing of fluid milk, and how do we keep fluid milk on the shelves? And a lot of people, I think, don't know what that order of fluid marketing, or excuse me, what the term, orderly fluid milk marketing means. And what it means is when you're selling a product that may be on the shelf 36 to 48 to definitely 72 hours later, all it takes is one processor to decide, hey, I'm not paying you for what you sent yesterday. I'm going down the road and I'm going to pick up Karen's milk instead because I can pay her less. And all of a sudden you have this domino effect hurting farmers. And eventually we think, and they thought 100 years ago, hurting the availability of fluid milk on store shelves. So through their lens, USDA has to look at all of the proposals and see which proposals should we bring up at a hearing. How should we lay out the hearing? Do we bring up proposals organization by organization? Do we bring up proposals type by type? Because we submitted, and you can read in the letters, Karen just reshared them in the chat box. We submitted 4 different additional proposals if they go to a hearing. We think they're a nice package, but if they just take one of our proposals, maybe that doesn't work as well if the other 3 are left out. It's also the reason that our legislation has 10 different parts, because we wouldn't want to just do one and give all the benefit to the farmers and then our processors go out of business. That's not the goal. We don't want to hurt our manufacturing plants, whether it's co-op or processor. We want maximum competition. So again, USDA's job is to say, here are the bounds of the hearing. They can make it as comprehensive as they want. That's what we want. That's what most people want, actually, or most organizations, I should say, is a fully comprehensive hearing. A couple organizations have said, let's just look at this path right here. And so That's what USDA has to decide. Is do we accept all of the proposals you named, Fred? I don't have the count. Did you say 48, 38? Or do we take 2 of them, or somewhere in between? So that's USDA's job right now. And then in late July, the secretary will declare, we haven't even decided yet, is it worth going to a hearing or not? So that's the decision USDA needs to make in roughly the next month. But like I said at the beginning, we know that if there is a hearing, all of you should book your tickets, book your hotels right now for Carmel, Indiana, beginning August 23rd. So we don't know if there is a hearing, but if there is one, that is where and when it will be.
Jim, did you have a question that you wanted to bring forward?
Yeah, there's some pretty prominent, not really dairy economists that have really suggested or hinted at, we'd be better off without federal order systems. We just should get rid of it. And I'm sure you guys hear the same thing. I know you didn't address this, and I know particularly Lucas and Minnesota Milk feel pretty strongly. So you do want to address listeners that what would be the advantage of that? Long term, would it be good? I think there's some producers that maybe feel the same way. So just address why we need, and I know, Karen, I think you covered that a little bit, but what would be the ramifications of just saying long term, maybe not short term, let's get rid of this archaic federal order system and let the free market have its way?
I go first, Karen?
Sure.
So again, the reason for the federal orders is to have orderly marketing in fluid milk. And so I think one of the fears is that you have a race to the bottom, as a fluid milk buyer could just switch day to day. And then if a contract dispute comes about, maybe we have empty store shelves for a while, right? That's not good for human nutrition. That's not good for production value. And I think if you pull behind the curtain a little bit, a lot of the rules that we set up at USDA especially, and FDA to a lesser extent, are about national security. We do not want products, goods from agricultural land that we are creating to be wasted. So if all of a sudden we have somebody producing milk and it's not being used, except for in rare exceptions like this last month when all the plants are full, but if it's not being used due to a marketing dispute, that's a waste of our GDP, it's a waste of our capital, it's a waste of all of our American resources. So I think that's one thing to think about. That is why these exist. We do not want wasted land, things that drive down the value of land, drive down the value of agriculture in America. So that's underneath all of this. Second, like I said a moment ago, and I've said a few times, orderly marketing of fluid milk. That's very important. But really, when we got into the task force, besides those 2 things, which are kind of core foundational things I personally believe in, and I think our farmers believe in, is all of the data that comes with it, and all of the things that are kind of entrenched in that system that allow all farmers to compete. And so I would argue that our federal orders likely allow more farmers to compete in more markets. So I believe you'd see more consolidation, more opportunity for relationships that don't benefit today's dairy farmers. And I believe that the data that we have that allows for transparent marketing, transparent risk management is very, very valuable. And so when we lose all of those things, there is definitely a net negative to the dairy farmer. And I also believe a net negative to US citizens, taxpayers, if we lost federal orders. And so that's what we're trying to do here. When plants depool, they're basically saying, at least for this month or for however long they depool, we see less value in federal orders today than we used to. And because we've been depooling a lot more the past 4 years than we have before, that tells us that, hey, we need to build value for our farm groups, for our processors back into the federal order system to keep it functional, especially up here in Federal Order 30, which is Minnesota, Wisconsin, plus some surrounding counties. So those are a few of the reasons I think it's very important for farmers to want federal orders. And I think US citizens and taxpayers, if they understood them, or if they were on this webinar, they should want federal orders as well. Karen, anything to add?
I think the 2 provisions that are probably top of mind that exist within federal orders right now that we are also advocating for in our legislation for contracting principles is timely payments, farmers being allowed being paid every 2 weeks for their perishable product. That only occurs if you are within a federal order and if your milk is pooled. So I think that's hopefully some of you, you learned something today. And like I said, it's not something that we have seen at this point in time that could be an issue, but we do know that there have been questions raised about payments and timely payments to farmers by processors. And I think I think we know that had we not had federal orders in place, we would see some different payment terms between processors and farmers. And so that should give us all pause that if the federal orders were to go away, the way in which farmers are paid can change. So that is that's a transition, and that's for a farmer, that's a lot more capital that they are going to need to have on hand that doesn't exist today. The other is that verification of weights, tests, and samples, providing that third-party verification that you as a farmer are actually being accurately paid for the milk in which you send to your processor. That is, for our members, that's something that they find valuable, and they find valuable enough that they're going to pay for it. So, and they, you know, they do, and they feel strongly about it because they need to know that they're being accurately paid for the components in which are in their milk and are going to their processor. So those two provisions are eliminated if the milk is not pooled and if that is if you're outside the federal order. So Jim, that goes back to the whole purpose of why we are establishing these contracting principles, that if for some reason the federal orders were to go away, farmers have some security in how it is the marketplace operates. And it is not, as Luca said, a race to the bottom. There are security provisions put in place to allow farmers to continue to operate in many ways, in a way that in which they have some certainty. Great question. Fred, is it okay if I read the next question that's in the chat?
Absolutely.
All right. Will potential changes benefit farmers across the US in all states? Lucas, do you want to give that one a go?
Yeah, so one of the reasons federal orders are so confusing and sometimes just hated because they exist is because a lot of you likely know that when it comes to a vote, if a hearing would happen, the hearing package would be put together, and then at the end, farmers and cooperatives representing farmers are able to vote either yes, we like this package, or no, it's voted out. There's no more federal orders. So that the reason that is because USDA is trying to make a more orderly marketing system, and if they have failed at that, it's a way of saying that no, we believe that making a more orderly system is not as worth as having these orders exist in the first place. So it depends. What changes will there be, and which farmers do they benefit? Because at the beginning, I talked a lot about regional flexibility, and I didn't go into that too much. We can certainly send you resources and some previous webinars we put on the past few years about some ideas we have for the Upper Midwest. But we just want regional flexibility because today, in our region, relatively speaking, we still have a lot of people drinking fluid milk, but we don't have a lot of people drinking milk relative to the amount of cheese produced here. And so that means our order has become very cheese dependent. And so if we wrote changes that just benefit cheese, obviously that wouldn't benefit someone in Pennsylvania or California or Washington State in the same way. And so we want to be careful as Edge, and I think most people want to be careful as how do we create a more orderly system that does provide net more benefit to farmers across the US. That's the whole goal of the system. But farmers do have the opportunity, and in some areas it's happened, to say, hey, we don't need our order here. Let's vote it out. And again, I think they lose a lot of benefits. They lose the verification of their milk, which is something that some areas don't have any way to counter right now if something's wrong on the check. And they don't get all the data, which we have heard over and over again. It's just so valuable. Maybe you don't need it today, maybe you don't need it tomorrow, but when you want to analyze something in the marketplace, that data is very useful. And so I hope the answer is yes, Sally, but it really depends. What does first USDA put in the proposal of what is in the hearing, and second, what makes it to the final proposal that USDA gives for all of us to vote on. Edge, we allow our farmers who ship to about 33 different processors. We allow them to individually vote on it. Some cooperatives block vote, most cooperatives block vote to vote for their farmers. And there's other organizations who believe that maybe we should have modified block voting, that maybe you should be able to vote against how your co-op's block has voted. So all these things are things that we think we could or should address in discussion in the Farm Bill. But right now, the way the rules are set is everyone who has a vote, which is farmers, unless their co-ops block vote for them, will have to decide the answer to your question, Sally. So that was a long answer to your question. Say it's up to the farmers to decide whether the changes will benefit them or not in their area.
Lucas,
Fred, at this point in time, with the interest of time, can we move on to doing a Farm Bill update, and then we'll come back to any Farm Bill, or we've touched on the federal order process, as well as the Edge milk pricing reform proposal, and then the third leg of our stool is Farm Bill. So are we okay to transition, and we can answer any questions at the end of that?
Yep, absolutely.
All right, super. Okay, so I'm gonna take us through a little bit of the Farm Bill process. I'm gonna go real basic here. So those of you who are well versed in the Farm Bill, please bear with me here. We don't have Farm Bill text yet. So a little bit about what the Farm Bill is and where we're at in Washington, D.C. So the Farm Bill is a 5-year piece of legislation. It is taken up every 5 years. It expires September 30th of 2023. So you say, what happens when we don't have a Farm Bill by September 30th of 2023? Well, so the option is nothing happens immediately, but likely we would see an extension happen sometime before in the December timeframe of this year to get us into 2024 to really look at a Farm Bill being passed in 2024. It has happened in the past where we haven't passed a Farm Bill on time. And oftentimes as that window between September 30th and the end of the calendar year gets smaller and smaller, there is a lot of conversation about the fiscal cliff and parity pricing and all of those things to scare people into voting for an extension. So that is, of course, all possible. At this point in time, your next question is likely, well, what are the chances of having a Farm Bill in 2023? At this point in time, we'd say it's probably 50-50 if we're going to have that. And I'm going to say before the end of the calendar year, unlikely by September 30th. We just haven't moved the needle far enough yet to have that done by September 30th. But by the end of the year, 50-50 shot. Some things that I think are important to look at are that we have the committee, the Farm Bill, the Ag committees will go to the Congressional Budget Office and they will ask for a CBO baseline score. And that is essentially how much is the Farm Bill, given the current programs, going to cost the federal government to implement. And we saw in February of 2023, that number was it was almost $1.3 trillion. So that's a huge milestone from the 2018 Farm Bill, which was over $850 billion. So quite a jump. Now, CBO has come up with a more updated score. So I told you that February number from the Congressional Budget Office was just over right around 1.3. They came out with a May number, and that number is just over $1.5 trillion. So it's important to note that of that $1.5 trillion spending, 1.2 is attributed to and allocated to the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, which is SNAP funding, nutrition funding for the variety of programs. So a significant amount of the funding for Farm Bill will go toward nutrition programs. So as you can see, that number has grown over 2023, and there is a fear that the longer Congress waits to pass a farm bill, the higher that number is going to go. And there is a real sentiment in Congress, especially by conservative Republicans, to really reduce spending. So I think that is important to understand that there's really an initiative to try and get a farm bill passed yet in 2023 so that we can reduce what that baseline, any additional costs in that baseline funding. But there's also a section of, there's some politics that come into play, and I think that's important. So we have, I'll start with the chairs of the respective committees. So in the Senate, we have Chair Debbie Stabenow from Michigan. She's a Democrat. Ranking member John Bozeman from Arkansas. And then in the House, we have Glenn G.T. Thompson from Pennsylvania, and ranking member David Scott is a Democrat from Georgia. So those are our, what we would call four corners. So they are really going to drive what kind of issues come up. How are we going to negotiate between the political parties, between farm programs in the Farm Bill and nutrition programs in the Farm Bill. As many of you are likely aware, as we went through debt ceiling and conversations, there was a lot of conversations about eligibility provisions within the nutrition programs, and there were some cuts made there. So while I think that is likely very helpful, we do have members in the House Freedom Caucus that are very determined to, they feel as though they are just getting started on implementing cuts to nutrition programs. And I think that's important for us to all be aware of, because what that's going to mean in a piece of legislation that has always been bipartisan is to essentially that would be dead on arrival. You are going to have Democrats who are going to dig their feet in. Many of those Democrats are not going to need the Farm Bill vote in order to get reelected. There will be a small handful of Democrats in the House that are on that bubble. They're in those marginal districts where they likely were elected with a 1 to 2 point margin, who will be advocating for a farm bill. They're going to need that vote to get reelected, or at least it'll be a lot harder for them to be reelected without a farm bill vote. So you have an interesting dynamic of politics playing out especially in the House right now, with what's being proposed and how we're gonna get a majority in the House to actually vote for a farm bill. So those are some of the political dynamics that go with it. It's never unexciting. So I think at this point in time, just talking a little bit about the process, the House is going to be the ones really starting the legislation in the farm bill this go around. They had a portal open, an electronic portal for members of the public as well as elected officials to submit their top 3 priorities for this farm bill. That portal closed last Friday, so all submissions have been in. Members of the Ag Committee have additional time to weigh in, and they have essentially additional slots. They're not limited to 3 ideas. But that portal was closed, and at this point in time, staff from the Ag committees are digging through those proposals and really looking at what is rising to the top as far as changes to existing programs, if there are any new programs that have been proposed, what that would look like. And a lot of those conversations are really going to come down to what does it cost to tweak existing programs or implement a completely new program. We started this conversation talking about what the program is going to cost. And while all of us on here are really focused on what those farm programs in the Farm Bill are going to look like, it is any tweaks to those and the costs associated with those are going to be really under a microscope because of the tremendous cost of the total package of the Farm Bill. So that's the summary that we have at this point in time. There has been no indication of when we're going to see legislative text and when the House Ag Committee is going to mark up a version of their bill. So we expect hopefully something to happen, to see some movement, some draft language in the next month to 2 months. But again, that's all going to depend on how quickly Chairman Thompson decides that he wants to move things forward. So at this point in time, that's pretty much the update we have on the Farm Bill. Happy to take any questions you may have on the Farm Bill or anything regarding the federal order hearing or Edge's milk pricing reform priorities. All right, so we have a question from Jim Selfer. With the division between the two parties, will they be able to work together on the Farm Bill? Jim, I think the answer to that is, I think the committee is going to have the ability to work together on the Farm Bill. Our committee, the ag committees have historically been very bipartisan. Your chair and ranking member have always worked very closely to keep the members of their party in line with the idea that this is a bipartisan bill. It needs to be a bipartisan bill, not splitting it apart, nutrition and farm programs. So I think from that perspective, from the committee perspective, yes, you're going to still see a bipartisan effort. And I think there are a lot of bipartisan efforts, even outside of the Farm Bill, to move this. But again, the Farm Bill is going to be subject to partisan politics by the time it comes out of committee. So we have to be prepared for that. And I'll make my plug. Your advocacy, all of you on this webinar, your advocacy is really important. So weighing in with your member of Congress on Edge's milk pricing reform priority legislation, other commodity groups that you participate in, what are their Farm Bill priorities? Pick up the phone, call your congressional office, let them know that 1, you want to see a Farm Bill this year, and 2, what do you want to see in it? That's really important for you to have that connection with your congressional office. Lucas, anything you want to add on that one?
If you can move to Minneapolis, St. Paul, Madison, Milwaukee, and make those calls, or honestly, if you have friends there, family, people in industry, like those get through, those matter. We're just going to need a few extra votes this year with the situations that Karen laid out. I'll read the next question to you, Karen, so you can address and get your words together. Is there a discussion from Tom Anderson? Is there discussion about increasing the DMC limit from 5 million pounds to 10 million pounds? And of course, DMC is Dairy Margin Coverage Program, which is a income over feed cost kind of reverse payment program.
So, Tom, the answer to that is yes. Several advocacy groups have the expansion of the DMC program on their radar. And have been talking to members of Congress as we have met with them. DMC and some changes to DMC has been on our list, and they have asked us as well about other groups and what our thoughts are on some of these DMC changes. So I think that is going to come back at cost to change the DMC limit from 5 million to 10 million pounds, and then in the same breath, there's some conversation about updating the historical production number and how frequently that occurs. And then I think there's some look at tweaking the margins and what the margins should be compared to what they are now. All of those provisions have a cost associated with them. From my understanding, the 2 big programs that are being discussed right now are cotton and dairy, and really changes to the DMC program. Those are going to be probably your 2 most expensive programs that are being discussed. I don't think that the ink is dry by any means on where the committee is going to come down on those numbers. There's going to be a lot of conversations with the Congressional Budget Office on if we do this and we do this, what is the number? So figuring out how much money they have to work with. And again, as more time passes, the cost of the Farm Bill is going to go up. And so at some point in time, there's going to have to just be this is it. So we are eagerly awaiting to see how that number or first proposal looks.
I'll also say, as we're talking about funding, I don't like using the term "there's money falling out of the sky" very often, but there's kind of money falling out of the sky on the conservation things, the Inflation Reduction Act and other items that have passed in recent years. Farmers for Sustainable Food, Edge, Minnesota Milk, DBA would continue to be active in that area, trying to line up where can we make farmers more sustainable with the conservation programs that are being laid out, whether it's through EQIP, through CSP, or through a different program, a new program. We are beneficiaries of a Climate Smart grant. It's a lot of money, but it will only be a small amount of money for every farm, but we need farms to sign up. So that is something else outside of the normal farm programs, out of the counter-cyclical and crop insurance programs that we normally talk about, that will simultaneously, whether we have a farm bill or not, be being rolled out over the next 3 years. And so watch for that. If you are interested in doing something new and innovative on your farm related to water quality or carbon, I think there will be new programs coming out, and Edge and Minnesota Milk, DBA, along with Farmers for Sustainable Food, hope to be at the forefront, matching up what farmers need and how those programs can work together, which is already funded outside of the Farm Bill, and we just are waiting for them to deploy. But like everyone else, the USDA has a people problem as well. They just can't find enough people to carry it out.
Well, Fred, I don't see any more questions in the chat. So at this point in time, the floor is yours.
Well, at this point, if somebody does have a question, please go ahead and get that typed in the chat. Otherwise, we'll do some housekeeping. Remind everybody, if they scroll to the top of the chat, there is in fact a evaluation of the program. We would very much like you to put your thoughts on that, and then remind everybody that this program will be archived. It'll be at the I-29 MooU.com webinars page. Give us a couple of 3-4 days to get that processed and into that format. So if no other questions, I'd like to thank Lucas and Karen. A lot of information here. We sure appreciate that. And we think that producers need to stay on top of this kind of information, because we have a new paradigm in our industry. We need to be part of those changes. At this point, we'd like to thank everybody for their attendance. Look forward to seeing them next month.
Thank you.
Thank you.